In the fall of 1876, railroad workers laying track through the hills of southwestern Missouri stumbled upon a discovery that would haunt them forever. Beneath the ruins of a farmhouse, long destroyed by fire, lay 17 skeletons arranged in precise rows, each missing specific bones, femurs, ribs, and skulls removed with chilling surgical precision. What made the scene truly terrifying were the brass medical instruments scattered nearby and a leather-bound journal describing 3 years of experiments in what its author called therapeutic anthropy, the medicinal consumption of human flesh. The Missouri State Medical Board swiftly sealed the records, while orders from Jefferson City forced the local sheriff to classify the incident as a tragic fire with multiple deaths. For nearly 50 years, the truth about Dr. Cornelius Endecott's secret medical facility stayed hidden. But tonight, thanks to recently uncovered correspondence and survivor testimonies, the horrifying story of Endecott Farm can finally be told. Before we continue, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss these dark chapters of America's hidden history. The discovery of those 17 skeletons was only the beginning of a story that would challenge everything people thought they knew about post-Civil War medicine and the desperate measures taken to heal the wounds of America's bloodiest conflict. By 1873, the Missouri Hills still bore scars of a war that had ended 8 years earlier. This borderland torn between Confederate loyalties and Union rule had endured brutal guerrilla warfare. Towns like Carthage and Joplin were slowly recovering, but the countryside remained dotted with abandoned homesteads and men scarred by invisible wounds no conventional medicine could touch. Into this fractured world came Dr. Cornelius Endecott, a Harvard-trained surgeon and former field doctor of the 14th Massachusetts Infantry. He had witnessed battlefield horrors at Antietam, where he worked 3 days straight in a makeshift hospital, more like a slaughterhouse than a place of healing. After the war, he spent 2 years in Europe, claiming to study advanced surgical methods in Vienna and Berlin. His letters, preserved by the Massachusetts Historical Society, revealed his fascination with new treatments for what doctors then called soldier's heart, now known as post-traumatic stress disorder. He wrote eagerly of German theories that diet could cure mental trauma and of Swiss experiments in mysterious essence therapies. In 1873, Endecott purchased 320 acres of farmland northeast of Carthage. Locals welcomed him, believing his private medical facility for treating war-related nervous disorders could bring hope to the region. He arrived with his wife Helena, a skilled battlefield nurse from a prominent Boston family, and their teenage daughter, Margaret. At first, the family seemed like a blessing to the broken community. No one yet knew what horrors the Endecott Farm would conceal. Margaret, just 18 and well-educated, worked at her father's side as his assistant in what he described as an exclusive practice for wealthy veterans willing to pay for experimental treatments. In August 1873, the facility officially opened with carefully worded advertisements across Missouri, Kansas, and Arkansas. The notices promised that Dr. Cornelius Endecott, Harvard-trained physician and war veteran, offered revolutionary methods for nervous disorders, melancholia, and war-related trauma. The ads emphasized privacy, comfort, advanced European techniques, and invited correspondence from families seeking alternatives to grim asylum care. The community of Carthage watched with curiosity as wealthy families arrived by train and continued by carriage to the secluded farm. These were not the poor seeking charity, but merchants, plantation owners, and officers able to pay significant sums for the hope of healing. Among the first was Captain Samuel Ridgefield, a Union veteran plagued by nightmares and violent seizures. His brother, a prosperous grain merchant from Kansas City, paid Endecott's hefty fee of $500 for a 3-month program. Samuel's last letter, dated September 15, 1873, expressed cautious optimism, noting unusual but seemingly scientific treatments. After that, his family received only polished monthly reports from Endecott himself, assuring them of Samuel's progress. The first sign of trouble surfaced in the spring of 1874 when Martha Cunningham, the widow of a Missouri lumber merchant, grew alarmed after her son Thomas's letters stopped abruptly in February. They were replaced with clinical reports in Endecott's handwriting. In April, she made an unannounced visit, traveling from Springfield by rail and then by wagon. She arrived at dawn with a hired driver, Josiah Brennan, who later said she seemed restless and anxious, constantly checking her watch and urging him to hurry. At the entrance marked by a plain wooden sign reading Endecott Private Medical Facility, she asked Brennan to wait while she went inside. From the outside, the house looked welcoming, freshly painted with tidy gardens and smoke rising from the chimneys. Yet Martha recalled a cloying, unnatural odor clinging to the place. Endecott greeted her politely, though his clothes bore fresh stains and his nails showed traces of something dark despite recent washing. He excused himself by claiming he had just finished an emergency procedure. His voice carried the calm authority of a learned physician, but his eyes, Martha would later say, burned with a fanatic's intensity. When she demanded to see her son, Endecott insisted Thomas was in a delicate phase of treatment that could not be interrupted. Instead, he ushered her into his office, where shelves of medical texts and anatomical charts surrounded her. There he presented detailed notes about Thomas's progress, filled with clinical language about dietary interventions and essence therapies. He assured her that Thomas was undergoing the most advanced treatments available in America, stressing that isolation from outside contact was essential during the transformation period. He even produced what looked like official correspondence with Boston and Philadelphia medical colleges discussing his anthropological dietary research. Martha pressed for details, but Endecott sidestepped her questions with jargon about neurological regeneration and cellular restoration. When she asked to see other patients or observe a treatment session, he declined, citing confidentiality and the fragile nature of his work. Frustrated but not yet certain of danger, Martha prepared to leave until she heard a sound that froze her. From somewhere deep within the house came a voice, human, yet warped, a sound that was either laughter or screaming. She swore it was Thomas, though distorted by something she could not name. Endecott quickly explained that patients often experienced emotional releases during treatment, insisting it was likely her son expressing joy at a breakthrough. His explanation was smooth, professional, even plausible. But Martha later confessed she saw something in his eyes that told her he was lying. The ride back to Carthage with Brennan was tense and silent. She asked the farmer if he knew anything about the facility, but he admitted he rarely traveled that far into the hills and had heard little about Endecott or his patients. Josiah Brennan's offhand remark about the small cemetery behind the Endecott property unsettled Martha Cunningham more than anything she had seen or heard inside the house. He told her it seemed far too crowded with graves for a medical facility that had been open less than a year. That night alone in her room at Carthage's only hotel, Martha poured her fears into a letter to her brother in St. Louis and began keeping a diary that would chronicle her desperate efforts to uncover the truth. Her entries from those early weeks show a woman torn between instinctive dread and the pressure to trust the reputation of a Harvard-trained physician. Her quiet investigation soon revealed disturbing patterns. She discovered that at least 6 families had also stopped receiving personal letters from their relatives, receiving instead only Endecott's polished monthly reports. Some families had left the area entirely, while others refused to speak about their experiences, avoiding her questions with fearful silence. The transformation of Endecott's practice into something monstrous was not immediate, but deliberate. A descent documented with chilling precision in the journal found decades later, hidden behind a false wall in the farmhouse basement. The earliest entries, dated from the spring of 1873, describe a doctor still determined to help broken veterans. He wrote about peaceful surroundings, structured meals, and his so-called rational conversation therapy, noting genuine improvement in some cases. Captain Samuel Ridgefield, for example, showed real progress in those early months, his tremors easing and his sleep improving under what seemed like simple rest and care. But by October 1873, Endecott's tone darkened. He wrote increasingly about a German physician he had studied under Dr. Klaus Hartmann, whose radical theories were rejected by mainstream medicine. Hartmann insisted that mental illness stemmed from deficiencies in vital essences that could only be replenished by consuming human tissue. Endecott's first attempt at this theory came with Samuel, whose improvement had stalled. In a journal entry dated November 3, 1873, he wrote that he had secretly prepared an essence supplement using tissue acquired from the local mortician Benjamin Struss and slipped it into Samuel's evening meal. Struss, drowning in gambling debts, sold Endecott fresh tissue under the pretense that it was for medical research, never asking questions. Within weeks, Samuel's nightmares diminished further and his violent trembling became less frequent. Endecott, convinced the improvement was due not to rest, but to the supplement, declared the therapy a breakthrough. Emboldened, he began adding human tissue to the meals of all his patients. Helena Endecott, who oversaw the kitchen, recoiled at first. Her diary, later discovered with her husband's papers, reveals her inner turmoil. In December 1873, she wrote that Cornelius had shown her German medical texts supporting his theories, and that Samuel truly seemed better. "If this can help these poor men," she confided, "perhaps we are obligated to continue despite my reservations. I pray God will forgive us for what feels like sin, but maybe science." By early 1874, Endecott grew frustrated with Struss's limited supply. His journal notes reveal an obsession with freshness, worrying that older tissue compromised vital essences. In February, opportunity presented itself when Lieutenant Marcus Thornburg, a former Confederate officer, under Endecott's care, died suddenly in his sleep. Helena found him lifeless in his bed, likely of a heart attack. But Endecott saw something else, the perfect specimen. Instead of reporting the death, he performed what he called a complete anatomical examination, harvesting over 15 pounds of tissue. He wired Thornburg's family, claiming their son had died of heart failure and was buried immediately due to health concerns. They accepted the explanation without question, even thanking Endecott for his devotion. Marcus Thornburg's family never suspected the truth that their son's body, laid to rest in the tidy cemetery behind Endecott's farmhouse, had been stripped of its organs and muscle tissue to fuel the doctor's growing obsession. Their money had not funded recovery, but had instead financed Endecott's transformation of death into what he insisted was medicine. With fresh human tissue now within reach, Endecott escalated his experiments, serving what he called enhanced meals to all his patients and recording their responses with meticulous precision. The men, trusting the authority of their Harvard-trained physician, ate without question. To them, the meals were part of a strange but promising treatment. To Endecott, they were proof of his theories. Yet natural deaths could not keep pace with his appetite for experimentation. By the summer of 1874, he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The arrival of Jonathan Prescott marked the point of no return. A former Union artillery officer, whose mind had been shattered at Fredericksburg when he alone survived the annihilation of his battery, Prescott embodied the depths of post-war trauma. His wealthy Chicago family, desperate and hopeful, had heard of Endecott's reputation through whispered recommendations and paid dearly for his care. Prescott's condition was severe violent rages, alternating with total withdrawal. And unlike the others, he did not respond to the essence therapy. After 6 weeks of supplements prepared from preserved tissue, his episodes grew worse, his resistance unyielding. Endecott's journal entry of August 15, 1874, revealed his frustration preserved tissue lacked the potency Hartmann had promised. The German physician's writings hinted that true therapeutic power came only from immediate consumption of tissue from the living. Endecott had resisted such measures, but now he wrote chillingly that Prescott's case may require extreme approaches. On August 23, 1874, he acted. His victim was Captain Samuel Ridgefield, the very man he had once hailed as his first success. Samuel, after nearly a year at the facility, had begun to deteriorate anemia, digestive failure, and what Endecott interpreted as essence cravings, though in truth they were the effects of malnutrition and psychological torment. Endecott recorded the event in cold medical prose, describing a merciful release by morphine overdose, followed immediately by extraction procedures. Helena Endecott's diary captured the horror in stark human terms. What Cornelius did to poor Samuel was murder, whatever name he gives it. But I have helped prepare those horrible meals. What does that make me? I cannot leave Margaret here alone with him, but I cannot see how to escape what we have become. God help us all. Samuel's family was told he had died suddenly of a heart attack, his body buried at once in the farm cemetery. In truth, his remains were dissected in a makeshift laboratory beneath the house. 2 days later, Prescott was served his first meal made from freshly harvested human tissue. The effect was immediate and disturbing. Endecott recorded the result as miraculous. Prescott's violent outbursts ceased almost overnight, replaced by calmness and a strange clarity. Within days, he was speaking eagerly with Endecott about healing sacrifice and what the doctor now described as a communion of vitality. But this was not recovery. It was a mind cracking under unbearable knowledge. Prescott's letters home, encouraged as part of his therapy, reflected his descent into delusion. Dr. Endecott has shown me truths beyond medicine, he wrote to his brother in September 1874. I understand now that life and death are part of the same essential process. I am becoming someone new, someone who sees the deeper connections. His family mistook the eerie tone for hope, never realizing it was the language of a man broken into compliance. By autumn 8, patients remained at the facility, each consuming human flesh daily, in what Endecott had begun calling communion meals. He believed himself the prophet of a new medical gospel. But outside the farm, Martha Cunningham had not abandoned her search for her son Thomas. Her determination only deepened when she began corresponding with Virginia Prescott, Jonathan's sister, who had grown alarmed by the strange shifts in her brother's letters. Together, the two women compared experiences, Martha bringing accounts of families who stopped hearing from loved ones, and Virginia uncovering troubling financial records, showing families still paying long after all communication had ceased. By October 1874, they saw the pattern clearly. Patients wrote letters for the first 3 months, then silence fell, replaced by Endecott's clinical reports. Families continued to pay for extended treatment, reassured by carefully crafted updates, even as their sons and brothers were quietly erased into the soil of the Endecott cemetery. What they had uncovered went far beyond questionable medical practice. It pointed to a secret too dark for most to even imagine. The third room was not a laboratory in the traditional sense. It was a chamber of ritual, a place where Endecott's madness had fused science with something far darker. Rows of chairs were arranged around a long wooden table, its surface scarred with knife marks and stained in ways that suggested years of use. At each seat rested a pewter bowl and spoon, as though prepared for a communal meal. On the walls hung more of Endecott's hand-drawn charts, but these were different from the anatomical diagrams in the surgical room. They combined medical sketches with religious imagery, portraying the consumption of flesh as both nourishment and sacrament. Judge Cunningham's report noted that the room contained articles suggesting ceremonial gatherings of patients wherein human tissue was consumed under the guise of therapeutic meals. Later testimony from Helena Endecott's recovered diary confirmed that her husband referred to these events as communions, insisting that the act of eating together not only healed the body, but restored the broken spirit of men shattered by war. At the far end of the chamber, a locked cabinet contained volumes of Endecott's private writings. In them, he described his philosophy with chilling clarity. The true healing required sacrifice, and that the strongest essence could only be drawn from the living shared in unity among survivors. He wrote of these meals as revelations, claiming that patients who partook experienced the calm of divinity and a release from nightmares. But the reality was far from salvation. Shackles were bolted into the stone floor near the table, suggesting that not all participants joined willingly. Several later accounts preserved in sealed testimony indicated that screams had often accompanied these meals, abruptly cut short by the sound of surgical tools. For Martha Cunningham, the most devastating discovery came in a final adjoining chamber, where locked cells lined the walls. Inside, gaunt men barely recognizable as the proud veterans they once were, sat in silence, their eyes hollow, their bodies ravaged. Some bore fresh surgical scars. Among them, she recognized her son Thomas, alive but broken beyond recognition. Deputy Hayes described the moment in his deposition. The boy looked at his mother but did not seem to know her. His lips moved as though whispering a prayer, but no words came. He was wasted, trembling, his eyes glazed like he had been starved or poisoned. God help us, I do not think he had long left. The rescue of the survivors and the arrest of Dr. Cornelius Endecott should have been the climax of justice. But what followed was silence. The Missouri State Medical Board and political authorities moved quickly to suppress the truth. Records were sealed. Survivors were placed in asylums under assumed names, and the official account reduced the entire affair to a tragic fire that destroyed the farmhouse and claimed multiple lives. Endecott himself vanished from the public record. Some said he died in custody. Others whispered that he was quietly relocated to an institution in Boston under a false identity. What could not be buried, however, were the diaries, letters, and testimonies preserved in hidden collections only brought to light decades later. They revealed not just a tale of murder disguised as medicine, but the story of how grief-stricken families like Martha Cunningham and Virginia Prescott uncovered a nightmare that the institutions of their day were desperate to erase. The trial of Dr. Cornelius Endecott in late 1874 would become one of the most tightly controlled legal proceedings in post-Civil War America. Federal authorities, fearing both public outrage and the discrediting of medical institutions, ensured that every session was closed to the public and that no details reached the press. Only a handful of court officials, attorneys, and medical examiners ever witnessed the spectacle of a Harvard-trained physician defending cannibalism as medicine. Endecott refused to accept an insanity plea. Instead, he doubled down on his conviction that he had achieved legitimate breakthroughs. In long, confident testimony, he cited German and Swiss medical theories, produced anatomical charts, and read from his journals with the tone of a pioneer unveiling new science. He described his patients not as victims, but as beneficiaries, men who had been freed from nightmares, trembling, and despair through his enhanced dietary protocols. He even argued that the cravings his patients developed for human flesh were proof of their bodies, recognizing what he called primal nutrients. His presentation was so methodical, so detached, that one juror later described him as a man who believed himself both savior and scientist, blind to the horror he had wrought. The prosecution, however, presented evidence that stripped away any veneer of legitimacy. Photographs of the basement chamber's testimony from Martha Cunningham and Helena Endecott's fractured diary entries painted a picture of cruelty hidden behind medical jargon. The most damning evidence came from the survivors themselves. Men like Jonathan Prescott and Thomas Cunningham, who were brought into court in restraints. Their gaunt frames, scarred bodies, and incoherent testimony stunned even hardened officials. One attempted to eat his own bandages during questioning. Another laughed uncontrollably when asked about the communion meals. These men were not cured, they were broken shells molded by Endecott's obsession. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the verdict was not straightforward. Political pressure, medical lobbying, and fears of mass hysteria shaped the outcome. Endecott was declared guilty of unlawful medical experimentation fraud and multiple counts of murder. Yet instead of public execution or a life sentence in a penitentiary, he was quietly transferred to a federal asylum in Washington, D.C. The official explanation was that his crimes stemmed from delusional medical mania, and that confinement rather than execution served justice. In truth, officials sought to bury the scandal along with its perpetrator. Helena Endecott, deemed mentally unstable, was committed to a state hospital in St. Louis, where she remained until her death in 1882. Margaret, only 19, was sent back to relatives in Boston after lengthy psychological evaluations. Records suggest she never fully recovered from what she had been forced to accept as medicine, living in relative obscurity until her death in 1911. The farm itself was burned to the ground in 1875, officially reported as an accident. In reality, federal marshals ordered it destroyed to erase what one investigator called a place where science and hell became indistinguishable. For nearly 70 years, the Endecott case disappeared into sealed files and whispers. Veterans' families were told their loved ones had perished in fires, accidents, or natural deaths. Doctors dismissed the story as rumor. But the discovery of Endecott's journals and Martha Cunningham's preserved diary in the mid-20th century forced historians to confront the reality. The legacy of Endecott Farm is not just one of horror, but of warning. It showed how authority, desperation, and secrecy could allow atrocity to masquerade as healing. It revealed the vulnerability of soldiers broken by war and the willingness of society to trust credentials over conscience. And it left behind an enduring question: if such things could be hidden in the quiet hills of Missouri, what else might have been buried under the guise of medicine during America's restless 19th century? Endecott's defense reached its peak when he addressed the jury, directly presenting himself not as a murderer, but as a misunderstood visionary. His arguments were so carefully constructed, so dense with references to European case studies and medical texts, that even some professionals in attendance admitted later they had briefly wondered if there might be truth to his claims. Gentlemen of the jury, Endecott declared, you are asked to condemn practices you do not understand, guided by moral prejudices that have no foundation in science. These men came to me broken, ruined by war, abandoned by conventional medicine. I gave them peace, clarity, and purpose. If you examine their conditions before and after, you will see transformations that speak for themselves. The prosecution countered with the most harrowing evidence possible: the surviving patients themselves. Thomas Cunningham, Jonathan Prescott, and Marcus Webb were escorted into the courtroom. Under careful supervision, their appearances preceded by extensive psychological preparation. Their very presence shook the jury. Thomas's testimony, in particular, left the room in stunned silence. Speaking in a calm, eerily detached voice, he described his time at Endecott Farm not as suffering, but as transcendence. It was the most meaningful experience of my life, he said. He explained that Dr. Endecott had helped him understand the deeper connections between healing and sacrifice, and that his war-born terrors had been lifted through participation in what he called the essential processes of renewal. When asked directly about the meals, Thomas betrayed no horror. Dr. Endecott explained that true healing required nourishment from those who had completed their journeys. It was an honor to receive such treatment, and I felt grateful for the chance to contribute when my time came. Experts called to examine the men struggled to put their findings into words. Dr. Augustus Peaton, a leading psychiatrist from Chicago, concluded that the survivors had been subjected to systematic psychological reconstruction. In his report, he wrote, "These men have not merely been traumatized. They have been methodically reprogrammed to accept and even embrace practices that should provoke the strongest human revulsion. Isolation, dependency, and the gradual introduction of taboo behaviors presented as medical treatment have created a form of psychological slavery more complete than anything I have ever encountered." Helena Endecott's testimony only deepened the portrait of corruption disguised as science. By the time of the trial, she was mentally unstable, weeping through much of her questioning. Yet her words illuminated how a wife and mother had been drawn into complicity. "He showed me medical books and letters from other doctors," she cried. "He explained everything in scientific terms I didn't understand, but it sounded real. When I doubted, he reminded me of Samuel's improvement, reminded me that we were helping men broken by the war. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him." Her testimony revealed the final, most unsettling truth of the case, that Endecott's greatest weapon was not his scalpel, but his authority. His victims, his wife, even other physicians, all had been ensnared by the language of science, persuaded that horrors beyond comprehension could be justified if cloaked in the promise of healing. Margaret Endecott's testimony was the most unsettling of all. At just 19, her voice carried the weight of innocence corrupted. She described preparing meals that incorporated human flesh, assisting in procedures she now understood were torture, and sitting through her father's so-called therapeutic discussions, where patients were indoctrinated into believing cannibalism was medicine. "Father made everything seem normal and necessary," she said. "He taught me that morality was just prejudice, an obstacle to true healing. I believed him, because he was my father, because he was a doctor, and because the patients thanked us. I thought we were heroes." The trial reached its climax when prosecutors unveiled Endecott's meticulously kept journals. Read aloud in court, the entries revealed not the incoherence of a madman, but the chilling logic of a man who saw himself as a pioneer. In one entry dated March 1874, he wrote, "The medical establishment rejects anthropophagic therapies out of ignorance and moral prejudice. History will vindicate these methods when physicians accept that true healing requires participation in the fundamental biological processes society has arbitrarily forbidden. The men under my care understand this truth and embrace it willingly." The jury deliberated only briefly before convicting him on 17 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death, though the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment due to concerns over his mental state. Helena Endecott, convicted as an accessory, received 20 years, but died of consumption after serving 12. Margaret, broken by her involvement, was sent to relatives in Massachusetts, changed her name, and disappeared from history after 1878. The three survivors, Thomas Cunningham, Jonathan Prescott, and Marcus Webb, were perhaps the most tragic figures of all. Thomas lived in an Illinois asylum until 1923, never regaining his old self, still begging staff for proper food. Prescott spent his final years in a Chicago institution, convinced he had taken part in a medical revolution, writing letters urging doctors to study Endecott's work. Webb returned to Kentucky, but could not reintegrate, ultimately taking his own life in 1881. The Endecott case shook American medicine to its core. It revealed the dangers of unchecked authority, the desperation of families seeking cures for their broken sons, and the terrifying ease with which science could be twisted into horror. In the wake of the trial, medical boards across the country imposed stricter regulations and inspections determined to prevent another Endecott Farm. The scandal also fueled skepticism toward experimental European theories, strengthening the push for American standards of care. Yet the case left behind more than reforms. It left a shadow. Dr. Augustus Piton's reports on Endecott's psychological manipulations became early studies in what would later be recognized as brainwashing and coercive conditioning. Veterans' care was re-examined, and the government began expanding hospitals for men suffering what would eventually be termed post-traumatic stress. Most disturbing of all was the discovery of Endecott's correspondence with physicians across 6 states, while no conclusive proof emerged that others practiced his methods. The letters revealed a troubling curiosity. One Kansas doctor even wrote, "Your reports on anthropophagic therapy suggest possibilities medicine has been too timid to explore. Could you provide detailed protocols?" Federal investigations later uncovered several facilities where patients had vanished under suspicious circumstances, hinting that Endecott's influence had spread further than anyone wished to admit. The farmhouse where it all began was burned to the ground in 1877, under the guise of a public health measure erasing physical traces of what had transpired there. But the story endured, sealed in court files, whispered in local memory, and rediscovered decades later. It remains one of the darkest episodes in American medical history, a chilling reminder of what happens when authority desperation and unchecked experimentation collide. Local residents never truly reclaimed the land where Endecott Farm once stood. Families abandoned nearby homesteads, convinced the soil itself was poisoned by what had taken place there. The small cemetery behind the house, where Endecott's victims were buried, was quietly relocated to Carthage's municipal grounds. At the request of grieving families, the graves remained unmarked, a silent field of the nameless dead. Martha Cunningham, who had uncovered the horror and lost her son to it, spent the rest of her life fighting for others. She lobbied legislators to strengthen oversight of private medical facilities, created a fund to support families seeking safe treatment for veterans, and became one of the earliest advocates for proper psychological care for soldiers. When her diary was published in 1923, it was hailed not only as a personal account of endurance and grief, but as an invaluable historical record of the failures that allowed Endecott's nightmare to flourish. The shadow of Endecott's crimes lingered in medicine and law enforcement for generations. Police departments adopted new procedures for investigating suspicious medical practices, while medical schools began introducing formal ethics courses, often citing Endecott as the prime example of how professional authority could be warped by obsession and pseudoscience. Yet even 50 years later, the horror refused to fully rest. In 1925, a team from the University of Missouri tried to exhume the graves for forensic study, but they found the sites obscured and untraceable. Locals, many descended from those who had lived through the case, resisted the effort, insisting the past was best left buried. The unsealing of the case files in 1947 reopened old wounds. The documents revealed that Endecott's operation had been far larger, more organized, and more deeply entwined with his family and victims than investigators had originally realized. Most unsettling of all were letters exchanged with European physicians who claimed to be conducting similar research. Authorities could never determine whether these correspondents were legitimate medical men or criminals cloaked in science. But the possibility suggested Endecott was not an isolated aberration, but part of something wider, darker, and harder to confront. His methods became a case study, not only in medical malpractice, but in psychological control. Early psychiatrists and criminologists examined his journals and the testimony of survivors, noting his use of isolation dependency and gradual indoctrination. These techniques, later echoed by cult leaders and totalitarian regimes, showed how authority could reshape morality itself. The three men who survived Endecott's treatments lived out their days as fractured reminders of his power. Their conditions would later be recognized as precursors to what we now call trauma bonding, and Stockholm Syndrome proof of how complete his manipulation had been. The story of Dr. Cornelius Endecott endures not because it is a tale of gore and cannibalism, but because it reveals how desperation, misplaced trust, and unchecked authority can conspire to produce horrors that feel almost impossible to believe. His victims became lost to both family and self. His family was consumed by complicity, and his community scarred by silence. More than a century later, the Endecott case remains a chilling testament to the dangers of power without accountability, and to the haunting truth that evil often disguises itself as healing. By the end of the 19th century, the Endecott case was already being recognized not only as a crime, but as a turning point in the history of medicine. Though physicians of the 1870s lacked the vocabulary to describe what had been done, the revelations forced the profession to confront questions of authority, trust, and ethics. A Harvard-trained doctor had used his credentials to mask atrocities, and the shock of that betrayal helped drive reforms, stricter licensing, mandatory oversight of private facilities, and for the first time, formal ethical guidelines for medical practice. Many of these principles remain cornerstones of medicine today. In retrospect, the case anticipated some of the very debates that would dominate the 20th century. The dangers of unchecked human experimentation, the illusion of scientific legitimacy without peer review or accountability, and the seduction of results that seemed too remarkable to question. Endecott believed himself a pioneer, yet his methods revealed the same flaws that later defined infamous cases of unethical experimentation, desperation, exploited consent ignored, and morality reframed as an obstacle to progress. The fate of Endecott's family only deepened the tragedy. Helena died in prison after 12 years, her mind fractured by guilt, though not before leaving behind a confession that offered investigators insight into how she had been persuaded step by step into complicity. Margaret disappeared into history, her new identity never confirmed. Census records suggest she may have lived out her life quietly in New England, her past buried as carefully as the unmarked graves behind the farmhouse. As for the farm itself, its burned ruins were eventually absorbed into a Missouri state forest, never to be privately owned again. Yet the land carried its reputation. Rangers reported that visitors often described feelings of unease, a sense of being watched, or sudden nausea long before learning of its history. The soil, like the story, seemed unwilling to let go of what had been done there. The legacy of Dr. Cornelius Endecott is therefore twofold: a medical scandal that spurred vital reforms, and a haunting reminder of how quickly authority can curdle into abuse when unchecked by oversight or conscience. It is a case that lingers not just in history books, but in the uneasy recognition that even science can be twisted into horror when humanity is stripped away. Whether the lingering unease around Endecott's land was true psychological residue, or simply the power of suggestion, we may never know. The medical instruments from his basement were destroyed by court order, but photographs and records preserved in law enforcement archives remain chilling evidence of how torture can be disguised as treatment. Dr. Cornelius Endecott died in the Missouri State Penitentiary in 1889, still convinced he had been a pioneer rather than a predator. His final request, recorded by the prison chaplain, was that his journals be preserved so future generations of physicians could vindicate his work. The Endecott case remains one of the darkest examples of medical criminality in American history, not only because of the crimes themselves, but because it revealed how easily authority, desperation, and self-deception can converge to create systematic horror. Endecott's unshaken belief in his own righteousness reminds us that the most dangerous figures are often not those who know they are committing evil, but those who believe their evil serves a higher purpose. More than 150 years later, the story still stands as a warning about the need for ethical safeguards, about the vulnerability of the desperate to exploitation, and about the terrifying consequences of unchecked authority cloaked in science. The 17 men who died at Endecott Farm, and the 3 who survived, only to live as broken shells of themselves, remain grim reminders of how quickly the promise of healing can become the reality of horror. But perhaps the most unsettling question is the one we can't answer. Was everything truly revealed about Endecott's operation? Or do darker secrets still lie buried beneath the Missouri hills? If this story unsettled you, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe the full truth ever came to light? And if you want more tales of hidden history and horrors that outpace fiction, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who loves mysteries. The past still whispers, and some of its secrets are more terrifying than anything we could imagine. See you in the next video, where we'll unearth another dark truth that history tried to forget.
Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.